Welcome to the book of 2nd Corinthians, where Paul's saga with the church in Corinth continues. And this relationship that he has with this church it's complicated, it's convoluted, it's kind of hard to follow, and I want to simplify it for you. So, in order to simplify it, you got to keep in mind two questions. When did Paul visit the city of Corinth? And when did he write a letter to the city of Corinth? And when you have those two questions in mind, you can kind of see how his relationship is laid out, where there is an initial visit, and he writes a letter, another visit, letter, visit. Kind of see that? It's arranged chiastically. Da, 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 da. What a stroke of providence. Visit, letter, visit, letter, visit. So let's kind of walk through these briefly, just so we can kind of lay the groundwork here. So in Paul's first visit, it's when he plants the church in Corinth, obviously. This takes place during his second missionary journey, and he stays there for a full year and a half. That episode is recorded in Acts 18. So, of course, he builds a strong relationship with the church there. And then on his third missionary journey, he's going to spend 2 full years in Ephesus. And all of this action is going to take place kind of from Ephesus. And he's going to write his first letter, a letter which we actually don't have. Scholars call it Corinthians A. He's going to write Corinthians A from Ephesus, telling those in Corinth not to associate with sexually immoral people. And Corinth is going to receive this letter. They're going to read through it, and they're like, I'm kind of confused. They're going to misunderstand Paul's meaning in that letter, and Paul's going to have to correct that in his second letter, Corinthians B, which we call 1 Corinthians. I mean, is this getting confusing yet? And in 1 Corinthians, Paul is going to respond to a report from Chloe, in which she talks about kind of the stuff that's going on in the city that Paul needs to respond to and correct. That's in 1 Corinthians 1-6. And then 7-16, Paul is going to answer some of the Corinthians' questions that they have for him. So next, in Paul's second visit, this is where the action relevant for 2 Corinthians really begins. This is what people have called Paul's painful visit to Corinth. It's a very brief one. And to kind of set it up, it seems possible that the reason Paul made this visit is because he received a report from Timothy about how things are going, how the church in Corinth responded to 1 Corinthians, and it's not a very good report. It seems that some in Corinth maybe have rejected Paul's authority or dismissing his advice, and it's very possible that there is one particular individual, a ringleader in the city of Corinth that Paul is going to address when he gets there for this painful visit. And we're doing a bit of guesswork here when we're kind of constructing this scenario, because you remember that when we are reading the letters in the New Testament, we have to do a little bit of Sherlock Holmes investigation skills, because we're just listening to one side, we're eavesdropping to one side of a phone conversation. We're trying to put the pieces together. Now, what we do know is that when Paul made his brief visit to Corinth, he had a run-in with a particular individual who pained him, who offended him, who attacked him in some way. Let's take a look at that. So here we are in 2 Corinthians 7, and if we look here in verse 12, it says that he wrote, not for the sake of the one who did wrong. So there's somebody, we're given a little detail here, there's someone who did wrong, and that individual is referenced back in chapter 2 as well. He says, if anyone has caused pain, he has caused it not to me, but in some measure to all of you. Now, this individual probably did cause Paul pain, but again, we're referencing a specific individual here who probably ran Paul out of town. He goes from Ephesus to Corinth. He's run out of town, and now he's back in Ephesus, and he's like, man, I got to deal with this problem. I can't leave things as they are in Corinth. So he writes another letter. He writes what is called a sorrowful letter or a severe letter. And let's look at some of Paul's references to this letter, which are contained within 2 Corinthians. All right, so let's go up a bit here. He says that I wrote to you in his sorrowful letter. I wrote to you out of much affliction and anguish of heart with many tears. And he says, man, the reason that I wrote to you instead of making another painful visit to you, this one was painful enough. I don't want to go through another one of these, was so that I may spare you. That's why I wrote to you. And the contents of this letter, besides just pouring out his anguish, he's going to tell, let me jump over here for a minute. He's going to tell the Corinthians to respond to act against, to take action against the opponent, punish the rebel is kind of how I'm summarizing in here. And let me show you that. Again, we're trying to piece together a little puzzle here in 2 Corinthians. So let's look at verse 9, where he says, this is why I wrote. This is why I wrote this sorrowful letter. I wrote that I may test you, to know whether you are obedient. Obedient to do what? Let's go back to chapter 7 again. We're kind of jumping between chapter 2, chapter 7, chapter 2, chapter 7, and there's a specific reason for that. So I wrote to you, not for the sake of the one who did wrong, we've already read that, nor for the sake who suffered wrong, but in order that your earnestness might be revealed. Earnestness to do what? And we think it's to take action against this person who offended Paul. Now, Paul is going to send this letter by way of Titus. He's like, all right, here's my letter, Titus. You carry this letter to Corinth. And how do you think Paul feels when he gives this letter to Titus and sends him off? Is he feeling confident? Is he feeling optimistic? I mean, he doesn't have a lot of reason to feel optimistic at this point. He's probably feeling pretty nervous. And he makes a plan with Titus. And he's like, all right, Titus, take this letter to those guys and then meet me in Troas. I'm in Ephesus here, but I'm going to go to Troas and then I'm going to come down to Corinth. But I want you to meet me in Troas and tell me all about it. And Paul is going to get to Troas, but Titus isn't there. And he's, if he was nervous when he sent the letter, he's even more nervous now, because he's thinking, man, they probably they didn't respond well to 1 Corinthians. They probably didn't respond well to my severe letter either. Now let's see this in the text. And again, we got to jump back to chapter 2, where he says, he went to Troas, and he's trying to find Titus there, but his spirit was not at rest because my brother Titus was not there. I did not find Titus there. So he's like, all right, Titus isn't here. Let me go on to Macedonia. And thank goodness, Titus was in Macedonia. So see this again, we're jumping to chapter 7. Even when we came to Macedonia, we had no rest, but God, who comforts the downcast, comforted us by the coming of Titus. Titus wasn't at Troas, but he came to Macedonia, and Paul was filled with comfort because of Titus's arrival. Why? Probably because Titus shared the good news of Corinth's positive response to Paul's sorrowful letter. Are you tracking with me? That we're getting into the complicated mire of Paul's relationship with Corinth here. So let me jump over to a map just so we can kind of quickly summarize this all of what we've shared kind of so far to this point. So this is Paul's third missionary journey. He's going to spend most of it here in Ephesus. And I want to start here with this blue line, which is Paul's painful short visit to Corinth, comes back. He writes his severe letter, and then he goes up from Ephesus to Troas, where he plans to meet Titus. Titus isn't there. Spirit's not at rest. Jumps over to Macedonia, where possibly he stays in Philippi. And then Titus arrives. He's relieved, and he's going to write 2 Corinthians there in Macedonia, which is our book. So why is Paul comforted by Titus's arrival in Macedonia? What was some of Titus's good news that he had to share with Paul? Well, it says here that in verse 7, Paul records some of the Corinthians' response to his letter. It says that they responded with longing and with mourning and with zeal. It says that Paul's letter grieved those in Corinth, but it was a godly grief which resulted in repentance. You see, the Corinthians were eager to clear themselves, it says here in verse 11. There was an accusation that hung over them. There was an individual within the church that ran Paul out of the city. And the godly, repentant ones in Corinth wanted to clear themselves. And Paul says they did just that. They proved themselves innocent in the matter. How did they do that? By punishing the individual. And after all of this, Paul says, man, I've got complete confidence in you. Now, isn't this an amazing statement? With this crazy relationship Paul has with Corinth, and Paul can turn around, he can say, you know what? I have complete confidence in you. I trust you now. Because of the way that you responded to my letter by punishing this individual. So let's see that again. Now, let me jump back and say that after they respond, take action against this individual, Paul says, you know what? It's time for you to forgive this guy. I mean, it sounds kind of harsh, right? Paul saying, punish him. But now Paul's going to say, we're jumping back to chapter 2, this punishment by the majority, hey, it's enough. You know what? If he's repented, forgive him, comfort him, reaffirm your love for him, and know that if you forgive him, I have forgiven him too. So taking a step back, the book of the letter of 2 Corinthians, it's a positive letter. This is good news. 2 Corinthians is a happy letter, responding to the happy news from Titus. However, there is still kind of in the air this need for Paul to defend his authority as an apostle. I mean, it's been called into question kind of again and again with his relationship with Corinth. So he has to affirm his authority as an apostle of Christ, and he's going to do that in this big section here and in this section here of 2 Corinthians 10 to 13 and 2 to 14. But just to kind of complete our visit by looking at this final visit, Paul's last time that he visits the city, he sends his letter of 2 Corinthians off by way of Titus again from Macedonia, and then he follows that letter himself with a visit, and he's only there very briefly for 3 months, during which time he writes the book of Romans, so that's kind of a cool detail, and he collects the money from the Corinthians, and after those 3 months, he goes to Jerusalem where he delivers the money for those suffering saints in Judea, and also where he's arrested in the temple there in Jerusalem as well. Now, in our next lecture, we're going to look at a massive rabbit trail, a long tangent that Paul goes on here in 2:14 to 7:4a. So Titus is referenced here in 2:13, and then Paul is going to jump on a huge tangent, which takes him all the way to chapter 7, where Titus comes up again. And we're going to take a look at that tangent in our next lecture.